So our third person on the panel today is James Rosenow. Her work is, her paper is Translated Modes of Poe-etic Synaesthesia in Early Amateur Cinema, Charles Klein's The Telltale Heart, and Sibley Watson's The Fall of the House of Usher. So also this idea between translating from Poe, from written to silent cinema, across modes, and so it should be very fascinating, and also kind of catches this connection between the 19th and early 20th century. So James has her bachelor's from Johns Hopkins University and her master's in art history from Williams College, and is working on a PhD at the University of Chicago in cinema and media studies. And this talk comes from an in-progress chapter of her dissertation.
Well, first off, thank you, Christian and Regine, for however ill-advised, including somebody who works on silent, black and white, and as far as I know, odorless cinema in a conference on synesthesia. And thank you very much to Olga and to the rest of the Art Lab team for all of your organizing efforts, and to all the other panelists. I'm sure they will continue, but every talk that I've heard so far has been wonderfully stimulating, so thank you. In a lecture from 1845, Edgar Allan Poe explained that any proper narrative should first be composed around an author's intended effect, rather than a series of events. He gives this account of starting the writing process. Quote, "Keeping originality always in view, I say to myself in the first place, of the innumerable effects or impressions of which the heart, the intellect, or more generally, the soul is susceptible, what one shall I, on the present occasion, select?" While his lecture was directly concerned with his narrative poem, The Raven, from the same year, this privileging of effect over event seems already to have been in force in the construction of his earlier stories, namely The Fall of the House of Usher from 1839 and The Telltale Heart from 1843. The effect of Poe's prose in these examples, as in many of his other stories, is one of strangeness and familiarity, doubt and unknowing, of the inexplicable and the ineffable, of impenetrability. Poe's creation, above all, was a habitable, sensory atmosphere in which these correspondences existed, a world where storytelling was not narrating a series of usually unfortunate events, but using words in order to create an effect on those who read them. Poe found appreciation first in France. Poe's French popularity had much to do with his ability to create an effect on his reader, which was achieved predominantly through the sound of his words. It is paradoxical, then, that precisely the specificity of the words and their sounds made translating his works into French difficult or impossible. After laboring for nearly 2 decades on his translation of Poe, Charles Baudelaire commented, "My very humble and devoted capacity as a translator does not permit me to supply the missing voluptuousness of the rhythm and the rhyme." Likewise, Stéphane Mallarmé shared Baudelaire's admiration and frustration, and would even criticize other Poe translators for their, quote, "speaking in French in place of Poe, rather than attempting to extract the song." Using words to approximate sensual rather than sensical experience, not dissimilar to music, was to become the principal pursuit of the symbolists. America was far less accepting of its native son. The struggles Poe faced during his lifetime — he was often on the brink of bankruptcy due to publishers' uninterest — carried over into the first decades of the 20th century. In an article from 1926, Poe at Home and Abroad, the popular literary critic Edmund Wilson pointed to the myriad of recent American publications on and attempted cinematic depictions of Poe that went to lengths to analyze his depraved lifestyle, frequently citing Poe's alcoholic tendencies, but which spent little, if no time, actually addressing his oeuvre. As a means of possibly recuperating Poe in the public opinion, Wilson pointed to the similarities between Poe and the modern symbolist authors. Ultimately, he didn't expect Americans to admire the ill-fortuned author. Rather, he showed that the Poe effect had infiltrated modern American literature. Whether or not Wilson's judgment was heeded, less than 2 years after his assessment of Poe, 2 American adaptations of Poe's stories were produced for the silver screen. James Sibley Watson and Melville Webber's The House of Usher, and Charles Klein's The Telltale Heart. It's actually The Telltale Heart on the left and Follow the House of Usher on the right. While these projects continue to exist in more or less obscurity, both received press coverage upon their release. A film reviewer for Close Up wrote the following praise after the premiere of Klein's film. A celluloid version of Poe's morbid story, the psychology of the story presents a distinctly different problem for film translation. Yet, at the hand of Charles Klein, the translator and the creator of this picture, the task has been accomplished with almost uncanny fidelity. The distinctly different problem to which the critic refers seems simple enough. As we have seen, Poe's early admirers followed Poe's lead in attending to the affective impact of his words, sounds, rather than the sense of the story they told. Put differently, Poe's words went straight to the reader's ear, rather than the inner eye that projects a fictional world. It was this sonic quality that made him difficult to translate into from one language into another. This leads us to the problem that occupies me today. How, then, can we understand the work of our silent filmmakers, Klein, Watson, and Webber, as an act of faithful translation? In what ways are their films engaging in a creation or evolution of a cinematic Poe effect? I will argue that Klein's The Telltale Heart, in keeping with a symbolist understanding, attempts sound visualizations within a narrative structure, whereas Watson and Webber's film pursued medium-specific effects so that the story was told solely through its effective force on the viewer. Throughout his work, Poe makes a point of conflating and even confusing the means of perception: eye versus ear, logical deduction versus inexplicable sensation, matter versus spirit. As narratives, both The Telltale Heart and The Fall of the House of Usher rely heavily on the character's oral perceptions. The Telltale Heart's narrator, an eventual murderer, continues to insist to his audience that he is not in fact mad, only that he suffers from an over-acuteness of the senses. Roderick Usher, likewise, explains that his familial residence has a superstitious force that also produces a morbid acuteness of the senses. In both cases, this affliction of the senses brings about the sufferer's demise. The murderer is compelled to confess his crime because of the incessant beating of his victim's heart, and the Usher family remain forever interned in their collapsed domicile. While the two films differ in their fidelity to the original narrative, both works appear less inspired by the stories than by Poe's notion that, quote, there are combinations of very simple natural objects that have the power of thus affecting us. The moments I will consider here will be those in which the directors pursue a cinematic translation of Poe's sensorial effects. Little is known about Klein's seemingly lackluster career both before and after the production of his Telltale Heart. His background in Germany was in theater. He was apprenticed as a cameraman for UFA sometime in the late 19-teens, and he went to Hollywood with his mentor, Lee DeForest, who asked the 25-year-old cameraman to accompany him on a business trip to Los Angeles. Around that time, DeForest was in negotiations with both UFA and American studios regarding his patent DeForest phonofilm technology. While DeForest's particular sound-on-film method was never adopted by American studios, from 1921 to 1929, DeForest produced hundreds of experimental sound films using his technology. He also collaborated with the Fleischer brothers to add sound to their animated shorts. This is a lovely example in which talkie meets mutie. DeForest also provided a recorded, synchronized soundtrack for the New York premiere of Fritz Lang's Die Nibelungen. This proximity to developing sound technology has never been factored into a reading of Klein's Telltale Heart. Unlike the makers of other experimental shorts from the time, Klein had both the resources and the familiarity to include recorded sound in his film, a directorial choice that would appear to have been in sync with a story that relies so heavily on the ability to hear. Regardless of the motives of Klein's decision, it is safe to assume that his awareness of developing sound technology played a role in his use of film language to tell Poe's tale. In Klein's film, there are 3 distinct moments in which the director breaks with traditional cinematic storytelling, and these are, not coincidentally, the moments in Poe's original text when the narrator's control of his senses is called into question, when he, as well as we, no longer can establish the validity of what is seen or what is heard. The 3 minutes of the film leading up to the homicidal action show shots of the narrator followed by the reverse shot of the old man, soon to be his victim. Anticipation builds. After a close-up on the narrator's hand as it cautiously opens the lantern, Klein shows the old man darkly lit in a medium shot with a long, thin ray of light scanning his face from right eye to left. It is worth noting that Poe's description of this in the original text is shot forth like a spider's thread. And this description of a projected ray of light is remarkably, albeit anachronistically, related to the sense of projection in the theater, a quality Klein appears to be directly referencing here. When the projected light falls on the old man's left eye, the camera jumps to a tight close-up of the man's face and quickly tracks even closer. At the moment when the eye is alone is distinctly visible, Klein overlays a kaleidoscopic painted image of a bewitchingly stylized eye. While the old man's eye remains constant in the background, the superimposed image seems to flicker until an instant later when both dissolve into nothing but white light. While the moment is extremely brief, and I'm going to show it here on a loop, encompassing a mere 4 seconds, Klein's technique is significant. In order to achieve the unusual dissolve effect, Klein destroyed the image itself by smearing emulsion directly onto the celluloid. This deliberate destruction of the medium comes moments before the destruction of the old man at the hands of the narrator. The destruction occurs at just the point when the narrator declares that he can see nothing else besides the eye. This inability to see could be accounted for by the darkness of the room, which we are informed is lit only by the crack in the lantern. But Poe's tone and Klein's material manipulation suggest it's more than this. It is the narrator's state of mind that causes the selective blindness, for not only him, but for those viewing the film, because we are also temporarily struck blind. While it is the blind eye that inspires the narrator's bloodlust, the 2 moments that could be described as breaks from rational perception occur not because of what he sees, but because of what he hears, and importantly, what he believes others will hear. The narrator confesses that even upon seeing the eye, he remains still. However, piercing the man's stillness and the room's silence, there comes a, quote, low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. It was the beating of the old man's heart. In Poe's text, the narrator states 6 times that the beating grew louder, to a volume so great that the murderer was certain the neighbor would hear the sound. It is therefore only the fear of auditory, not visual detection, that led to his panic. Again, there is an outward extension in both text and film. While Klein does use an inner title in this case, his heart, it's his heart, the beating of his damn heart, this narrative aid is superfluous for a careful viewer. For 8 seconds before the inner title is introduced, the camera focuses closely on the narrator, whose head begins to nod, as if synchronized with an increasingly rapid beat. Followed the inner title, the shot is repeated for another 8 seconds, as both the nodding and the character's agitation escalate. Then, just as in the story, the moment of extreme pathological rupture occurs. Over the course of 10 seconds, Klein presents a flurry of images alternating at great speed that distinguishing one from another is futile. The viewer can make out flashes of the narrator, the old man, close-ups of the eye and the shrieking mouth, and the kaleidoscopic image of the eyes seen earlier in the film. Across each frame, uniting the montage, Klein again exploits the medium by chemically burning the word kill directly into the celluloid. Just as Poe's hand inscribed the effect of the moment onto the page, Klein has handwritten these words onto his images. The manner in which the letters seem to writhe on the screen due to the frame-by-frame animation adds to their eeriness. Kill is clearly the imperative verb flashing across the narrator's mind, but is he actually hearing a voice commanding this action? Is this what the beating heart sounds like for a man with acute hearing? In addition to kill, there is a momentary flash of a series of lines that move like a comet across the narrator's forehead, stopping just beyond his ear. This is followed immediately again by another kill posted directly across his forehead. The motion of these lines, the motion of these lines from mind to ear suggests that the source of the sound is internal rather than external, but as before, what is real remains elusive. It is precisely the elusive, evasive quality of the narration and the emphasis on the sensuous material rather than the sense of sound that create the Poe-like effect in this film. Poe's unanswerable question remains unanswered by Klein. What did the narrator really hear? Did an insane man hear the dead man's heart beating, or did the sane man confuse the sound of his own heart with his victim's? This unknowable, or perhaps for us, the audience, unobservable origin of a sound figures likewise in The Fall of the House of Usher. The climax of this text occurs when, spoiler alert, we learn that Madeline Usher, Roderick's invalid sister, has been buried alive. This discovery comes when the narrator finally hears sounds echoing out of the crypt. Like the first, our second silent film, Watson and Webber's Fall of the House of Usher, discovers its gruesome secret with suspended letters. Here, the floating letters loosely compose the words beat, crack, scream. While the words are recognizable, the letters themselves appear upside down, moving out of proper position, in reverse or otherwise disarranged. These onomatopoeic utterances literally hover in a space between an identifiable emanating source and our ears. Apart from the similar use of text, Watson and Webber's Usher functions very differently from Klein's Heart. Melville Webber was a painter and art historian at the University of Rochester, and James Sibley Watson was a medical doctor by trade and president and active contributor to the literary magazine The Dial. Neither Watson nor Webber said much about their films, but in a short essay published in a trade magazine entitled An Amateur Studio Picture from 1928, Dr. Watson wrote this: "We finally selected Poe's Fall of the House of Usher, which neither of us had read for 10 or 15 years, and which we therefore felt all the more able to treat as raw material. We suffered from the pseudoscientific prejudices, the essence of modernism, which makes people believe that each medium of expression can and should be isolated and purified just as a chemical compound is isolated in the laboratory." The essay goes on to say that they were not interested in making the spectator connect empathetically with a single character, as one does in a cheap novel, but to make him feel the whole piece like a piece of poetry. This connection to both modernism and poetry owed something to Watson and Webber's unaccredited contributor and college friend, E. Cummings. Cummings' relationship to film, while rarely considered today, ran deep. In notebooks from the early 20s containing his musings on aesthetics and art in general, Cummings jotted his own ideas about the capacities of cinema. It could seamlessly alternate between the seer and the being seen, manipulate time, and even bring the dead back to life. Above all else, the cinema, according to Cummings, could think. Throughout 1924 and 25, Cummings and Watson's made plan to experiment with Watson's recently purchased camera equipment with the intention of creating two films based on the same simple scenario. One film would be done in the conventional and solid manner, and the other in a non-solid manner. While this particular project appears never to have come to fruition, Watson and Cummings continued to discuss film throughout the planning of Usher. In letters from 1926, the men exchanged loose shooting scripts, which Cummings called film arrangements, as well as thumbnail sketches, diagrams, and typed shooting directions and analytical notes. What Cummings and Watson meant by non-solid cinema could possibly be assessed by comparing it with a contemporaneous work. At the same time as Usher was being developed and shot, Cummings was busy at work at the production of his first play, Him. As a sort of warning to his theater audience, Cummings included a disclaimer in the playbill. It read, "It's a play, so let it play. And because you are here, let it play with you. Let it tiptoe back and snap its fingers under your nose. Let it sweep up at you from below and pounce down on you from above. Let it creep cautiously behind you and tap you on the back of your neck. Let it go all around and over and under and inside you and through you. Relax and give the play a chance to strut its stuff. Relax, stop wondering what it's all about. Like many strange and familiar things, life included, this play isn't about, it simply is. Don't try to understand it, let it try to understand you." This simply is approach, one that is multisensory and particularly tactile, I would argue is echoed in Watson and Webber's film. Watson and Webber devote roughly a third of their intertitleist film to depicting Madeline Usher's demise, death, and burial through the repetition and transformation of particular cinema-specific effects. The Madeline sequence begins with a carefully composed shot of Madeline slowly approaching a coffin. In the lower corners of the frame, two superimposed fragments of staircases move progressively downward and off the lower edge of the projected image, suggesting progressive movement toward the family crypt, which is located in the original text beneath the house. A shadow of a hammer bangs against the coffin and seemingly beats Madeline down. She eventually collapses backwards, and once her figure has disappeared off screen, the middle portion of the shot fades to black, leaving nothing but the moving stairs. The subsequent shot shows only the stairs, which over the 6 seconds becomes less tangible and ultimately distilled into pure lines of light. This dissolution of visually identifiable objects persists throughout the remainder of the film. This scene cuts to a shot of transparent overlaid coffins, another reference to Madeline and her imminent demise. And then we see Roderick and Madeline occupying the same room. Rather than allow the shot to reestablish a concrete space, the camera begins to tilt in the same direction in which Madeline collapsed in the first shot. After 2 more shots of floating coffins, the camera returns to Madeline, who is now dead. A revolving lens distorts the 19-second shot in which the camera moves to outline the contours of Madeline's dead body. Though we never have seen her actually placed in the coffin, a series of shots then implies that she has been interred. A hammer appears to swing itself over and over again until the job is complete. Then it is thrown into the corner of the room along with a pair of gloves, almost as though a crime has been committed and the disembodied perpetrator is disposing of the evidence. The fictional world grows more distorted. A series of shots connected with a white fade show yet another close-up of Madeline's lifeless face, multiplied in a moving prism. Roderick appears and stares at the space as it becomes more broken before his and our very eyes. The rooms continue to seemingly crumble until, in a climactic moment, a cropped image of Madeline is overlaid on a broken image of a room and Roderick lying on his back. Madeline stretches her hand forward to the camera, to us, as if the breakdown of her already fractured space requires her movement into ours. The movement is repeated before her face dissolves in the image of the shadow, and the image of a shadow of a hammer returns. These visual tricks and tropes are not given a cohesive narrative flow, but rather stammer like undecipherable utterances, which ultimately, as Watson suggested, are to be considered as a whole, as an isolated means of expression. Herein lies, I would argue, the crucial distinction between these two poetic translations. I don't mean to declare one film more successful than the other. Their aims are different. Indeed, each project, from their very outset, states its primary objective. Klein's picturization of Poe's immortal classic highlights the separation of sound and image in filmic technology, a separation the audience is meant to acutely experience. While Klein's film is silent, He frequently uses inner titles culled directly from Poe's text, and it is precisely that the words and images are separated that is of interest to Klein. For then, the direct etching of the words onto the celluloid, which references the directly inscribed soundtrack of the sound on film method, becomes even stranger within the context of a silent film. The aural confusion of Poe's story becomes the moments of visual indecipherability and oddity in Klein's film. The audience, through their visual reading, enters and occupies the space of the insane man, unable, however briefly, to distinguish the events and only able to feel the effects. The opening shot of Watson and Webber's film, with a prismatic superimposition of a page from a book, is the only explicit reference to Poe's tale. In fact, without this marker, it would be difficult for an uninformed viewer to identify the source material of this film. It doesn't make much sense. Such a modernist abstraction of the source text makes one, again, think of Cummings and other American poets with whom Watson and Webber would have had direct contact. Rather than rely on the reader to parse the words, the poem derives much of its effect from the space and shape those words create on a page. Deciphering the parts is not as important as experiencing the whole. Rather than offer us an opportunity to understand its disjoint events, the film, like Madeline's hand, reaches out to understand us. Watson and Webber create an Usher in which the house and its inhabitants do not invite us to experience it, but one which reaches out to experience us. As Watson said, and I believe Klein would have to some degree agreed with, the plot is of little consequence. For both films, it is all about the constructed effect film has on the audience's senses, whether it projects outward or compels our imaginary entry, as we are forced to fall back on the conclusion that these films reflect, beyond a doubt, the power of very simple things to affect us. Thank you.
Film, but they look in a way very professional. So, from which archive did you find Gods and Fun?
Well, I have a very lovely advisor who has an archive in his head, and he just tells me to go and work on things.
Tom Gunning?
Yes, it is Tom Gunning. And it's this, my larger project is about these amateur films, and I'm questioning the idea of amateur, because in my mind, these are avant-garde films. But they were all, when they came out, they were all labeled amateur films, and they were published in amateur trade journals. It's because at the time, none of these men were specifically directing in Hollywood, and therefore they're amateur.
I wonder if you could say some more about the rhythm of these films. I mean, when we speak about synesthesia, so how would be the temporal ordering of the film itself? I mean, have this kind of synesthetic side effect, especially when you had this one clip where, I mean, it was not clear if this heavy breathing was a kind of projection onto the corpse or if it was his own. So I thought this was an tremendously interesting allegory of film viewing. On some levels, this kind of incorporating corporeal reactions and somatic reactions to a film.
I do have to say that I debated for a long time between doing the Klein film or doing the other incredibly more famous Fall of the House of Usher by Jean Epstein. Because with the Jean Epstein, it makes a really nice comparison with the Watson and Webber, because the Epstein is very lyrical, very much an extension of a symbolist kind of symbolist strand in film in France at the time. And the Watson and Webber is frenetic in its pacing. It is very quick. The entire film is about 10.5 minutes long and has over 400 shots. It's very, very, like individual animated kind of shots, but it's a very fast-paced thing. Whereas the Telltale Heart, it's only those moments of psychic break from rational sensation, as I said, in which we see that. And I think that Klein is using the montage, which of course at this time in the 20s was something that the amateurs were reading about in terms of the Russian films making it across the ocean to the States. And I think he's using montage to mimic a altered state of mind.
First, I guess.
I think your last statement was really rather interesting about the film reaching out to the audience. How would one be able to tell that or gauge that? I mean, that's the sort of question. But of course, films do reach out for specific persons. And fairly recently, there have been films about the silence and the change to the movies and voiced sound films, etc., particularly that film Art, I think it was called, if you remember. But it also crops up in literature as well. There's a book called The New Confessions by William Boyd. Have you read that?
Yeah, I have.
That's a very interesting book about a man who could not adapt to the modern cinema at all. But then another way in which a film affects a writer, particularly, can be seen in Paul Auster's famous book, The New York Trilogy, because the names he chooses in part one are from Edgar Allan Poe and from the critics, the writers who have written on Edgar Allan Poe. Now, is this a kind of homage, or is this a further extension of the idea of the film reaching out to the audience?
No, that's a very interesting point. I find that moment where she reaches directly to the camera to be a very interesting one, specifically because it was Cummings' idea, and it's in his notebooks to have that gesture, which it becomes a more popular gesture, but later on, I mean, this being 28, like having that kind of reaching out, filling up the entire frame with the hand is a very peculiar thing to do, because we just have gotten over the point where, you know, it's in classical Hollywood, you never look at the camera. And so this is, it's a very, it's a rebellious gesture that I think they're making in doing this in this film. And the Watson and Wimber film actually was shown fairly widely at the time. So I think it was a, look what we're doing. I read it as a very modernist film, whereas I see the Klein as being more in a symbolist tradition. I definitely, the dissertation ends with Hitchcock, as most things should.
Yeah, thank you for your talk also. It was very, very interesting for me. And I have a very stupid question now, but I'm asking you because I think you touched a crucial topic here now, which was mentioned before also with the word incorporation, and I would also like to add the concept of embodiment to this whole topic here. How would you connect your lecture now to the topic of the conference to synesthesia? I can't remember you mentioned the word.
I read over my paper at lunch and I was like, oh God, I don't have that word anywhere.
Yeah, but I think that's very interesting, and I think that's what I would like to know, and I think that would be a point where everyone here could go on. How is the body, our body, connected to the synesthesia? And it's not just the brain, which has been mentioned before all the time. I think it's much more the whole body which has synesthetic experiences.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, one of the things that I find so fascinating, even though I work on films from later on, because they're amateur productions, they usually don't have sound. So I'm dealing with these things that, as I said, are black and white and have no sound. And yet I find that means that, you know, not just a cineast is applying colors and sound to this experience. So it's all of us. Like, we all watch, you know, the beginning of Wizard of Oz and are waiting for, like, when we get to see the red shoes. Like, we add those colors to cinema. And I think the embodiment also is because of the apparatus of the camera guiding us through these spaces. There's an opening shot that I had to cut out for time in which rather than entering the space of the house of the Usher, there was a fake kind of paper over the camera and it burns away. And so it really is more about the stage coming out to us, whereas in Telltale Heart, the camera moves into the space. And I didn't show it because it just looks like Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, like tilted walls. But no, I think that the embodiment issue is so much of what I find synesthetic about cinema, because the camera is our surrogate so much of the time. Like, again, Hitchcock, like Rope, the way the camera moves through the space in that film is about our place in that space and having a very, like, sensual experience. So that's what I would say.
Okay, Lisa?
Thank you for an interesting talk. I think it's very interesting to work with black and white movies and talk about synesthesia, especially because how image work on our, how we perceive image, because we always project colors onto the images. And that's why we can trigger the association and what we learned, like just an image like this, there's a face is not white, I project skin color onto this image. And that's how synesthesia also works, you know? In our association, if we see a tree, it's a signifier, and then it's green. And so I think it's a very interesting direction that you have.
And to further that a little bit, it also goes into, I mean, I'm not talking about digital cinema here, but like when we see, it's 24 frames a second, we're seeing 24 images a second, and the way that we perceive that in and of itself is such an interesting phenomenon in terms of the things that we've been talking about.